Hi, welcome to KSU Summer Intensive, online and virtual. We are trying it online this year and hope that you all benefit from the things that you learn here. We will be doing some cello basics in this class and then also talking about how to prepare good orchestral excerpts and also how to come up with a good college audition video. So I'll be doing different things in a few little segments. We're going to start today with cello basics. So many of you have already mastered the basics, but let's talk about them just to get that covered. This class will be primarily for high school students. Students who have been playing the cello for between 1 or 2 to about 6 years, intermediate and advanced level. So for cello positioning, we want you to sit at the edge of the chair with a very straight back and your knees over your ankles in a 90-degree angle. The cello will touch in 3 places: your inner knees, 1, 2, and then, as I say to my little kids, let it touch your heart on the torso. We don't want feet up on toes or wrapped around the legs of the chair. We want to be very balanced on the chair so that we're able to feel grounded and sturdy. Let's talk about the bow a little bit, bow grip. If you just hang your arm, take the bow away for a second and just hang your arm down, the placement of the thumb is generally, for most people, about opposite our second finger. So if you look at that and place the bow in there, that's a pretty much perfect grip, okay? So we don't have to do any crazy things to guard against, keeping the pinky stiff up on top of the bow, a collapsed thumb, and often we have too much space between the fingers. So just a natural, relaxed bow grip. Put the bow in your hand and there you've got it. We want to have a little something called pronation, or angling the hand towards the bridge. Supination would be this way. We want pronation. Okay, and then the placement of the bow on the string is very important. We need a contact point that's going to be about an inch or so from the fingerboard, from the edge of the fingerboard. And then we just want to take a bow in a straight line. String, the bow will be pretty much perpendicular. You'll look like you're making a capital T when you look down the string, and the bow will go across. For A string, you're going to actually push your hand slightly away from your body to create an angle so that your bow is headed towards the bridge a little bit. For C string, you're going to do the opposite. You're going to bow towards your body a little bit. So you can actually do a really nice exercise when you're warming up in the mornings or when you first sit down with your cello. You can do 4 open A strings, full bow, maybe quarter notes at about 60 on the metronome, then same on D, G, and C. So a full long bow, focusing on your contact point, your straight bow, the angle of your bow, and getting a good tone quality. Let's talk a little bit about left hand. The shape of the left hand is going to be a relaxed C shape, C for cello. And we want to make sure to be squared off to the fingerboard. We don't want angles this way. We don't want a bend or break in the wrist in any way. and the thumb will always be opposite the second finger. If you have an extended position, the thumb goes along with that second finger in the extended position. Okay, and the space is between 1 and 2, first and second finger. So that will require a little bit of lifting of the upper arm. We want the shoulders to stay down as low and in their position as possible. We don't want to lift the shoulders up because that creates a lot of tension. But the upper arm will need to be up. Imagine when you're a little kid, you had the water wings when you were in the pool. The arms are up. So for cello, we want arms up like that. Okay, so those are some basics for cello positioning and posture. I hope those are helpful to you. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about with regards to playing the cello is shifting. Shifting is one of those things that we have to do quite a bit of on any string instrument, particularly on cello. The distances can feel sometimes quite far away. We don't have any frets or keys or buttons or any way to know where we're going. So it has to be basically muscle memory that we use and a repetitive action. Almost like if you were a basketball player, you'd have to practice your free throws over and over, just doing that motion over and over until you really have a timing worked out. So we could do a shifting exercise. Doing an octave shift, starting on B flat and going up to the next B flat, so it'll sound like this. So if you notice, I'm keeping my left elbow rather high, my upper arm high, so we can get around the shoulder of the cello. It's difficult to shift because of this piece of the cello, so we need to keep our upper arm high, and then almost give a little impetus with the elbow, a little circular motion in order to shift. Okay, and we want a slow and relaxed shift, no jerking, no jamming, not digging into the fingerboard, but there's a slight release and a glide and then an arrival. So we release slightly and arrive. So we can do those octave shifts and then go up. We'll do 2 per note and then go up by half step all the way up to D. So here's how it will sound. Now being natural. C sharp, 3rd finger. And D, 4th finger, the 3rd finger. So you might ask, when does the thumb come up? For most people after the C sharp, sometimes depending on your hand shape, definitely by D we have to bring the thumb. I don't know if you can see that. But. So for C sharp, I still stretch and leave the thumb back, and then for D, that's when I bring the thumb. Okay, so it's a relaxed, soft motion. And then we can also do, just practice this first, up and down the fingerboard. And then we can do 2 octave shifts. Wow. It's okay, it's safe, we're going closer to the ground, we're not gonna fall. So that will sound like this, B flat to B natural, C, and so on. Say, how in the world am I going to find that note? You need to shift slowly enough so that you can hear when you arrive. Listen to the note. When you hear it, stop shifting. Okay, so that's kind of fun thing to try. But the whole idea with shifting is we press, then we release slightly. We never, of course, lift off the string, but we release the pressure. Don't try to dig a trench into the fingerboard. Keep it nice and lifted, and then an arrival, slow and relaxed. Most people, if you're missing shifts, it's because you're jerking or too tight. So those are some tips for shifting. The next thing I wanted to talk about is vibrato. That's one of those tricky things. For some people, it's just very natural and can do it right away. For a lot of us, it takes quite a bit of learning to really achieve a natural, relaxed vibrato. So we can start with our second finger on the A string on a C, and then just think about rocking back and forth on the pad of the finger. Nice and loose and relaxed and slow. Tension is not vibrato. We don't want this sort of really tight, nervous sound. I'd rather have you do a slow, relaxed vibrato and then later work on speeding it up. So that will sound. You can just even imagine there's a little old-fashioned rocking chair right there. You're just rocking back and forth on the pad of the finger. And here's first finger. I just have it close to the fingerboard, but I'm not actually squeezing or touching. So that also helps with a nice relaxed vibrato. We can also do it in a rhythm. We can start doing like eighth note rhythmic pulses. So you're actually going down underneath the pitch, you're going flat about a quarter tone and then back up, sometimes even as wide as a half a step. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and. So you can just start with that to get that motion, and then you can double it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then faster still. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then a little faster. And then all the way. So you can practice that with a progressive, getting faster with the pulsing. Then practice maybe on first finger. For a lot of people, fourth finger is a tricky one. Not everyone. Some people are more comfortable there. But if you like, you can add the third finger just to sort of give it a little extra strength or balance. Some people prefer to just stay on the fourth finger. And those are some tips for achieving a relaxed, natural sounding vibrato. We want to sound like a singer, nice and relaxed. No tense, nothing like that. Okay, next thing we can talk about is a little bit about thumb position, which is unique to the cello and also to the double bass. We use thumb position so that we can travel the bigger distances more easily. What we'll do today is learn a thumb position scale starting on our D harmonic. So sometimes when we tune, we find these harmonics. Find your D harmonic, and instead of third finger, which we often use to tune with, put your thumb there. Don't have to press it down for now, just touch it. And put 1, 2, 3. 2, 1, thumb. Thumb position, we want to have a nice C curve, C shape, C for cello here, and a nice flat thumb. So the hand is relaxed and in a slight curve. We don't want any collapsed knuckle here. We want it like that. Okay, let's do the same thing on the A string. So find your A harmonic and put a thumb there. 1, basic thumb position shape. Now if we put those two together, we'll have a D major scale. So start on the D string and keep going all the way up to the A string third finger. A basic thumb position exercise. Make sure that your thumb is straight across and your three fingers are working efficiently in a curved position. The only thing that should touch is your fingers and your thumb. You should not rest your wrist on the cello or anywhere else, okay? When you're practicing your scales, whether it's thumb position scales or regular scales, I prefer to use no vibrato just to have that purity of pitch and intonation. Sometimes it's easy to hide behind vibrato. Once we've learned our vibrato, we like to hide behind it. So for scales, whether it's in our first position scales or thumb position, in general, I like to practice them with no vibrato for a really pure intonation. So I hope those are some tips that help you with some specific cello issues that come up. Let's talk about tone production. One of the most important things on playing a string instrument, and particularly on cello, is to have a warm, beautiful, lush vocal sound. We want to sound like singers. So ways of creating good sound. First thing, there are 3 points to creating sound and getting the correct sound for each piece. You want to think about where your bow touches the string. Is it going to be close to the fingerboard, close to the bridge, or somewhere in the middle? So here's just an open D string in the middle. Good basic sound. Now here's something called flautando or sul tasto. Sounds almost like a more airy, fluty sound. And then if we get right close to the bridge, that's a very intense sound right at the bridge. And if we really want to sound very intense, we do Untitled. So that's sort of a scary sound for a special effect. So we need to think about where we want to place the bow. That is called the contact point. Another aspect to sound is the bow speed. Are we going to do a very slow bow or a fast, light bow? So some combination of bow speed and contact point. And the third aspect to sound production is the weight. Okay, so are we going to use a lot of pressure? Press very hard or press very lightly? So, contact point has to change when the left hand changes. So our contact point mimics the action of the left hand. If we're going higher, if we're shifting higher, the bow has to go closer to the bridge in order to create the correct sound. So if I play here, make sure you can see. And if I go up an octave, stay in the same position. And up another. Oh, sounds terrible, right? So we have to get closer to the bridge. So that's very important for any kind of playing, but especially when we're practicing scales in the third and fourth octave. You got to change your contact point. So those 3 things, contact point, bow pressure, and bow speed, are how we create a good sound. The other thing is we sometimes have to use concepts that are a little bit hard to describe when we're talking about a feeling, but we want to use a flexible bow hand and dig into the string. So not to be skating on top of it too much, but that we're really in the string. if we want a rich sound, we're going to use a slow, heavy bow. If we want to have a very light, happy sound, usually we'll use more light, fast bow. Okay, so those are some ways to think about creating a good sound. We also want to use a lot of arm weight and use gravity, the Earth's gravitational pull, to get down into the string. If we're lifting our shoulder too high and skating on top of the string, that sounds tight. So we want a relaxed bow hand and arm. So those are some tips for sound production. Let's talk a little bit about how to practice excerpts, orchestral excerpts. A lot of times for an orchestra audition or placement in the school orchestra, and even all the way up to professional orchestras, they want to hear little snippets of orchestral repertoire, pieces that are popular in the repertoire and maybe have certain challenging sections that they want to hear how you do with that. One of the most important things for excerpt practice is that you want to start early. It's not something you want to cram in at the last minute. So make sure you get your excerpts early, get them printed out, get your music bought, however you're going to do it, so that you have something that you can start with early. You want to find at least 3 good recordings of your excerpts from professional ensembles, and do a lot of listening. And you can listen with your part in front of you, have your music in front of you, and then listen through, find your little section and listen for things like articulation, things like tempo, style, timing details. Sometimes there are things that we do that are traditional that it's not even marked in the part, it's just what everybody always does, and that's a tradition. So you've got to have listened enough so that you know those things. When you're away from your instrument, sit down and take note of every single marking that the composer has indicated. A lot of times there are little things that we just wouldn't notice in the heat of playing it and just sight reading through, but there are little tempo indications, articulation indications, every little dot, every little fly speck we have to do for an orchestral audition. Make sure that you take note of tempo markings, any character indications, every dynamic. All of those things matter. You want to be the player who notices and does everything on the page, because if you're maybe the 20th person to play for the audition committee, they take note who does those little details and who doesn't. Once you've mastered all those little details, then you can add your own personal interpretive ideas or musical expressive ideas, but make sure first of all that you notice and do the things that are on the page. When you start to practice them, make sure that you start slowly. Don't, especially for tricky, fast excerpts, don't start at the fastest tempo. Make sure that you do use your metronome and know the goal tempo, but start slowly so that you can build it correctly. Figure out some good fingerings and bowings and mark them in your part. You can experiment with different ones, maybe ask a teacher or a friend what they do, or take note in some of the recordings. There are video recordings, you can observe what they're doing. And then mark those in your parts and do them consistently. If you have an alternate fingering, you're not sure which one you want to use, put the other one underneath the notes and mark the main one on top. Practice with great attention to detail. Basically what you're doing is taking a little rough, it's like taking a little rough stone and polishing it under a jeweler's eyepiece. Detail, 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 day in, day out, and every little facet matters, and eventually with enough polishing you'll have a very beautiful and expensive diamond. Okay, so it's lots of detailed work, more so than if you were playing a whole concert or recital. It's just every little facet, every little aspect of the excerpt matters. Make sure that you always use a metronome throughout your practice process, certainly when you start, and then throughout. Occasionally test yourself with your metronome. Make sure that you're not rushing. Make sure that you haven't changed the tempo indication in your mind. Somehow you start playing it much faster or slower. So tempo is always a big issue for excerpts and listening to auditions. You want to make sure that you're not rushing or slowing down, but keeping a very steady tempo. You could practice in front of a mirror also. That's a good advice anytime, but especially for excerpts, you can check your form. You can check also for things that shifting and so on. If you're having problems with shifting, you can see what's going on in the mirror. Also record yourself on video or audio to see how your intonation is going. Sometimes we're so busy making the music in the moment we don't notice, but sometimes we can get sharp or flat in certain areas. So make sure that you listen back to your recordings. So those are some ideas for how to prepare an excerpt. And if you do those things, it will work out very well. It really does help. Okay, let's talk about how to make a good college audition video. Some of you may be interested in pursuing a career in music and may be thinking about auditioning for different schools. So let's talk about how to have a good audition video. First of all, you want to choose pieces that showcase your own strengths and pieces that you're comfortable with and that you've been working on for a while. Don't pick the hardest thing you know that you just started learning to make yourself learn it faster. That's not a good way to choose your audition video. Choose your repertoire based on what works for you, what showcases your best playing and that you know very well. You want to choose two contrasting styles. So if you choose something slow and lyrical for your first piece, then you might choose something more technical and fast and a little bit showcasing some of those other skills so that we can get a good sense. Good pieces to use for cello. We like to hear an exposition from a major concerto, something like Haydn, Boccherini, Saint-Saëns, Elgar, something like that. Dvorak if you have it. And then, or something like a sonata such as Brahms or Beethoven. You could do a solo piece like Fauré Elegy, Saint-Saëns Allegro Appassionato, Dvorak Silent Woods. And then you might want to contrast that with something from a Bach suite. Usually suites 1, 2, or 3 are good places to start. And the preludes are good to have because they're a little bit longer and really showcase what you can do. Prepare and practice your pieces. You want to overlearn them so that they'll stick with you, even if you're a little bit nervous or feel a little uncomfortable, that you'll really still be able to do them because you've learned them that well. You want to be able to play through your piece several times in a row without too much time in between so that you can work on your stamina and make sure that you have a really solid knowledge of the piece. Again, you want to make sure that you're working with metronome and that you've worked in front of a mirror and also recorded it and listened back to yourself to see how it's coming across. If you're able to use live or pre-recorded piano accompaniment on your tracks that for your video, that's great. It's nice, but it's certainly not necessary. When the day comes to make your actual video, you want to choose a quiet location with good lighting and a relatively uncluttered background, something that isn't distracting. And you want to position your camera or your other device so that it shows your left hand and your right hand, your bow hand, and the contact point on the string. So make sure that you have enough space so that the whole cello can be seen, or most of the cello. You may have to prop your camera up on some other device than your music stand. It's good to wear something comfortable and nice, something that you might wear for a job interview. Bright colors are sometimes a nice touch for playing on camera. You want to make sure that your shirt doesn't have buttons or cuff buttons that buzz on the cello. That can be distracting. Introduce yourself and introduce your pieces when you do your audition video. We like to hear you speak. We like to get a sense of who you are and what your personality is. That also helps us learn to pronounce your name when you introduce yourself. When you finish, thank your committee for listening. That's always a nice thing to say. And just like in concert audiences, we like to hear you speak a little bit and get a sense of your personality and what kind of person you are a little bit. When you record your video, play as if you're live on stage. Put some love and musical expressiveness into it and your own personal very best sound. Really go for it. And always keep one ear out for excellent intonation. That's something we never can forget about. You may want to record each segment separately, and I recommend doing at least 3 takes of each movement or segment. That way you can choose from the best one. You may want to do this over the course of several days so that you can stay fresh and not become too fatigued when you're making your video. And then once you've finished that, you can upload it to your school's preferred video audition site. At KSU, we use Accepted, and that works really well. So those are some tips on how to prepare a good college audition video. Let's talk about scale practice. One of the most basic things that we do on any musical instrument is practice scales and arpeggios to get around the instrument. Some books that I like to use, I usually have students start with the Klingel technical studies. Those start with 2 octaves and go all the way up to 4 octaves with a variety of different bowings. It also gives the arpeggio fingerings and so on. And once you become more advanced, I usually go to this Mark Yampolsky Cello Technique book, and that has all sorts of things like scales in thirds and octaves and sixths and scales in chords and tenths and all sorts of things. This will keep you busy for a lifetime of technique practice. And then if you're interested in some other styles of music making, Accidentals Happen is a good compilation of scales by William Somick. And this book has 26 scales in 3 octaves in all the different modes. So if you're interested in learning to play jazz, blues, so they've got scales in major and minor modes, dominant, 7th, pentatonic, ethnic, diminished, augmented, whole tone, jazz, blues, and chromatic scales. So that really covers a variety of styles. So let's talk about how to practice scales effectively. You're going to want to start, make sure you're well in tune. It helps to have in tune strings to play an in tune scale. We'll just start with a basic C major scale. Make sure that your contact point is good. For the C string, you're going to want to play slightly towards your body. And I suggest starting with a quarter note equals 60 for your metronome. And do practice them actually with metronome sometimes to check on your tempo. And I suggest using no vibrato just to really listen for pure, beautiful in-tune playing. So let's try a C major scale. C major scale. Maybe you observed some things like the speed that I did shifting, hopefully not too fast and relaxed. At the contact point of the bow, as the left hand goes higher, so too does the bow. So on this C, I'm about here, an octave higher. So it's very important to change the contact point. When you're up in high position, make sure that you bring your thumb along with you when you're doing your shifts. Don't leave it back there. So those are some basics on scale technique. Let's talk about arpeggio now. There are many fingerings for arpeggios that are acceptable, but I like to do the universal fingering, or I like to teach that for 4 octave scales in arpeggios. So you're always going to start on C string for universal fingering, and the second note will always be a shift. So you'll always shift up, even if you're starting on B. Oops. So that's, wow, way up high, right? So here's C major 4 octave arpeggio. So we're going to start open 1, 4, 2, shift 1. Okay, so shift to 1, 3, 2, shift to 1, 3, 2, shift to 1. Shift to 2, 3, shift to 2, shift back to 2, so let's try that in another key to just show that that works in every key. So here's D major. We're going to start on 1, shift to 1, shift to 1, shift to 1, shift to 1, stretch to 2, big stretch to 3. So once you become very advanced and get used to playing your scales in 4 octave scale, or arpeggios in 4 octaves, we can do something called our octave scales. So that's, we start first with broken octaves to kind of get used to it. So we'll start with the open C, back to C major, and then the upper octave. Now we're going to put our thumb on D and third finger. As you become comfortable with that, you can make them solid octaves, maybe after a few weeks or months of that kind of practice. So that's a good way to start learning your octave. And the octave position is very important. It's also the way we do false harmonics. So we push down the one note. So here's our octave. So that's all within an octave position. And then our thirds and sixths all come from that position. And we can even do a little exercise like that. And so on. Just to get used to all the positions. So octaves are very useful. It's almost like a capo that takes us across the strings. So those are some basics on scale practice, and then a little bit more advanced stuff with thumb position. Hope that's helpful. Well, thanks so much for joining me for cello-focused version of KSU Summer Intensive. Please join us again. Feel free to go on our website, arts.kennesaw.edu, for any further information. And we hope to see you again soon. Have a great summer.